Okay, so this is the second video about Homer, and as happened, it took me a whole hour to say a very small portion of what I had to say, even when I'm cutting it and cutting it from what I have been thinking. So you'll have to bear with me on that. So let's think a little more about the story of the Iliad, and just to remind you, um, look at it through the filter of the characters, um, and their relationship to the virtues. So, self control in relationship to eating, drinking, and sex. The Trojans got it wrong and paid a huge price. So, what did they do? Paris, Priam is the enabler. He thinks wealth can buy his way out, and he ends up, his city is decimated. Um, and the Achaeans overreact. He didn't really deserve that, but it was decimated, um, sacked. And then on the other hand, the Achaeans are the city that became consumed by the desire for power and power struggles, and they won the war, but for the wrong reasons. No, and nobody in the area, or nobody who heard the story, would ever think that the Achaeans actually went over to Troy and reaffirmed hospitality agreements. And when they left, the rule of law was sacred once again. No way, Jose. I mean, in the story of the sack of Troy, after the Trojans had clearly lost, no problem. The Trojan horse, the gates were opened, to then go and rape the women and the children, to kill children and sack the city, is not going to assure anyone that civilization has been preserved. Uh, so that's completely bogus, and that has to do with the anger. The virtue of anger was not to overreact or underreact. And if you underreact, you hold a grudge. And Ajax is a perfect example of somebody who held a grudge. When Odysseus went to visit him in Hades in the Odyssey, he was still holding his grudge against Odysseus because he didn't get the armor of Achilles. It went to Odysseus. And I think the story, the message there is, look, give it up, right? Stop being so fixated, because if there is a Hades, you're going to be for eternity uh, on fixated on whatever obsessed you so badly. So if you get that obsession, you'll be miserable in this world and you'll be miserable in the next world. So get over it, Ajax. Okay, but mostly the problem was the other extreme, was to take revenge and to overreact. And that is a nemesis. I mean, that was a terrible problem for the Achaeans, and it led to their committing horrendous injustices and not succeeding at regaining the sanctity of the rule of law. The next one is pride. Oh my gosh, rational pride is having a good judgment about what is honorable behavior and what is dishonorable. And someone who thinks they deserve more honor than they do is vain. And someone who thinks they deserve less is also at an extreme. Um, and a person who has rational pride would rather give other people honor than take it himself, because he's more concerned with the city than with himself. And I wouldn't say the characters in the Iliad are very good at that. um, the other big issue with that was Hera is the goddess of honor, and she gets her honor from being the wife of Zeus, because this is a patriarchy. Um, and when Zeus has affairs with other women, or when he listened to Themis, his first wife. This dishonored Hera, and so she would get back at him, take revenge, by not caring about justice. And of course, the people do this. What the gods do is a reflection of people, which in the 14th line of the Iliad, Homer says you're not supposed to take this literally, hint, hint. But on the other hand, if people do, they could identify with Hera and Zeus and still think Hera and Zeus actually do this, but also think, but we don't do this. We have to flesh it out, right? They get to live out our fantasies. And then the people who write the stories understand that they're symbolic and they're intended to get people to flesh the stuff out. So you end up with the same result. You're not supposed to imitate the gods. You're supposed to flesh out all that stuff. So Hera, the big issue there was with Ares. At one point, Ares engages in massacre. He has a double-edged sword, and he goes and kills people on both sides, just without any concern, to show everybody how brave he is. And that action received condemnation in a way that the gods hardly ever condemn each other. But Zeus, god of justice, Athena, goddess of justice and wisdom and just war, and Hera, all three of them condemned Ares, which of course is very telling because the human beings in the Iliad do massacre people and get massacred by each other, and all these people die without any point, and some do it because they want that honor, that glory. And so the story is saying, no, there's nothing honorable about massacring people. So that's important. That was rational pride. You shouldn't be rewarded or honored for that kind of behavior. And they fight all sorts of things. Who gets the armor, who gets this and that, who deserves this, whatever. Okay, then ambition, rational ambition. You can want too much power or too little power. And one of the issues there I think of is with Odysseus and Hector. Odysseus would have been a much better ruler than Agamemnon or than Achilles, but it was really Agamemnon. But he doesn't try to have a coup, right? He doesn't say, would you please let me rule? This is ridiculous. Instead, he acts as a counselor. He advises Agamemnon to give back the priest's daughter. And Agamemnon at first refuses, and then there's a plague, and okay, would you please do it? Okay, okay. And then Odysseus tries to advise Achilles to come join the war so that we can get this over with, and he doesn't either. So it's clear that in some sense Odysseus deserved to rule, and he was not in the position he should have been in. He should have more power, but it's more appropriate for him to act as a counselor. The same thing happens, of course, by analogy with Zeus and Athena. Zeus does things, especially the case where Hera wants to get back at Zeus because she's mad at him for his infidelity and his listening to Themis. So she seduces him, thanks to Aphrodite, gives her this girdle and this perfume, and gets him really sexually turned on, because Poseidon wants to run the Achaeans, and Hera wants to get back at Zeus, so she seduces him. Zeus has hot sex and literally falls asleep at the wheel, and then Poseidon takes over for a while. So the main thing is that Zeus is the god of justice, but he makes all these mistakes, whereas Athena doesn't do stuff like that. So in some sense she ought to be running the show, but she doesn't. She just asks to be an advisor to Zeus. She doesn't want power, but she wants to be able to give advice. Well, it's just like Odysseus and Agamemnon. Um, on the other side, Hector knows that his brother Paris should give Helen back. He's disgusted with his little brother. His little brother, um, okay, early on, they decide that Paris and Menelaus should have a duel, and whoever wins gets Helen. So if Paris would win, Helen stays in Troy and the Achaeans go home. If Menelaus wins, Helen goes with the Achaeans and the war's over. So they made a covenant agreement, and Paris lost, but Menelaus refused to kill him. He just said, okay, you got it. And he let him go, and then he said, okay, I take Helen and we go home. And Paris broke the agreement. Horrendous, right? Horrendous. So Paris is a rotten guy. So you have these two young people in each city. Each city has a young man who is a tyrannical soul, what Plato would call, who basically wraps the city around their finger. And because of their immaturity, and because the leaders allow it to go on, they are able to bring ruin to their cities. Ah, outrageous. Completely outrageous. But again, Priam doesn't force Paris. He allows him to break this covenant agreement. And it's much more serious than, anyway, it leads ultimately to the sack of Troy. So, so Hector is the just son. He's obviously a good guy. He has a great marriage. He's a great dad. He leads. He cares about his people most of the time. Rules for the sake of the ruled. And so he ought to take over for his father. He ought to have a coup and send Helen home. But he doesn't. He accepts his place. So this is the issue of rational ambition. And it just gets people thinking. Are there times when it's better to have a coup? Or is it more rational to just accept the situation? Hector gets in the situation where he knows he doesn't have the just cause, but he still rules for unity, rules for his people. He most of the time has good strategy, and then when he puts on the armor of Achilles after he kills Patroclus and puts on Achilles' armor, then he oversteps. He gets too full of himself, and when Achilles comes, he doesn't go send the Trojans back inside the gates. He takes too many risks, and that was a big mistake. So Homer, again, makes a bad decision. And not Homer, Hector. But Homer says at one point that everybody makes a mistake at some point. So, and that's true. I mean, that's just a lot like life. So we have these characters, and some of them are clearly better than others. They have a better way of life. But even they make a mistake. And because the city depends so much on them, when the city doesn't listen to them, everybody suffers. But when the city, when they make a mistake, the city suffers also. Okay, then there's a sense of humor, irrational humor, and there's funny stuff that goes on. There's sociability, people putting up with small injustices just to keep the city going. Again, a lot of them don't. They don't put up with little slights. They get all full of themselves, and it creates so much faction. But when they do, then it's obvious that everyone benefits when people are willing to put up with things. And then self-knowledge, being truthful about yourself, not boasting and not being self-deprecating. So that's really a problem in the sense that Achilles, I think, was a lot more full of himself than he should have been, and he was honored too much by the others when he made all these mistakes. He had a lot of potential. It's just that he was abused by Agamemnon, and he in turn made all these mistakes, and so he thought he was a lot more honorable than he really was, and so did other people, obviously. Um, okay, then justice as a character trait. We have that process of deliberation, but we also have justice as a character trait was how to make good laws, and that's throughout the Iliad. They're trying to make covenant agreements or oaths. Some of them are good and they get broken. Sometimes they don't make an oath when they should. Sometimes they make the wrong oath and they follow it and they shouldn't have followed it. So um, how to retribution, right? How to punish injustices. Obviously, taking revenge is not the way, and so that was an abuse there. The pleasure from profit, again, that was the Trojans thought they could buy their way to peace and security. That didn't work. The distribution of social goods, and the one example would be who gets Achilles' armor, and there were other things along the way, but that issue comes up. And equity, how to apply the law to a certain situation, and they're deliberating about that all the time. They have a good principle, but they don't apply it well at various points. There's also the other qualities, activities of soul, according to Aristotle, like understanding. Understanding is ability to think about other people's lives and other people's choices, and to make good judgments about who's more virtuous and who's less virtuous. And the book is filled with people talking about people. And Odysseus, the Odyssey, especially when Telemachus comes and goes and visits Nestor and Menelaus, and they're reflecting on the meaning of all of this. And it matters. It matters how they interpret it, because that determines, are we going to have any more wars? To me, the most outrageous part of that was when Telemachus came to Menelaus' house. And it was beautiful, right? Sensuous, blah, blah. They just celebrated a wedding. But they didn't apologize to him. They didn't, feel any remorse or regret that the reason Telemachus' father was gone, the reason he's looking for his father, that was because of what Helen did. She just seems so oblivious. It just drives me nuts. And Telemachus doesn't say anything. I just think Homer describes the situation, and people have to interpret it. And how they interpret it tells you a lot about the people. I just think today in America, we're sending people out to war. The motive is oil. We still invite people over to our weddings, have these huge displays of wealth, are obsessed with physical beauty and glamour, and it doesn't occur to us. But sometimes it doesn't even occur to the people who suffer, which seems to be Telemachus, that, the cause, this is the cause of why you had to go over there, was this greed and this pride and this self-indulgence, sexual attraction, this purely physical beauty. So I just think that's a good case of where they're reflecting on things and they're getting it all wrong. And so again, it's so funny, scholars actually think the Greeks are serious. Like, well, they just thought that's the way it is. No, no. They're trying to get you to first of all identify with that. I understand that. I get that. And then, oh my God, I could do that. I could be that ignorant. I could sit there and talk to that young man and not apologize to him, not feel any remorse, not point out to him. Oh, God. But we do the same thing, and that's why there's scholars who don't agree with me on this. And it amazes me because it seems like it's excellent because it's a puzzle, right? He gives you the situation. If you don't get it, sorry, I'm not going to ramrod it down your throat. But it should be a reversal and recognition. It appears everything's peachy keen. The reality is nobody seems to have learned anything or have any regrets. Ugh, that's so sad. Anyway, and then in this deliberation process, like a lot of people can have good opinions, but in the critical moment, because of their weakness of character or their ignorance about the details, they make the wrong choice. It's just that they also have to be talking to each other about human affairs in order to educate each other, which is exactly what the audiences who hear Homer are supposed to be going to the taverna and talking about it. So they're supposed to be talking about human affairs to each other, just like the characters in the Iliad and Odyssey are talking about human affairs to each other. And also the gods are, obviously. Then, when it comes to, okay, so there's no gap between personal virtue and vice and political virtue and vice. There's no private versus public. This would be obvious in a case of war, but the Odyssey is about Odysseus' personal life, and again, in the Iliad, you start out with a public situation, and you end up, you can't fight a war because of the personalities involved, and the character traits, and the weaknesses, and the excesses. And then when Odysseus turns for home, and he starts looking inward, thinking of his wife, thinking of his inner life, again, that has a lot of political ramifications because when he makes a mistake in his personal life, his troops, his soldiers, the sailors on the boat suffer. And he has this relationship to the sailors, which is one of ruler ruled. So they have this little mini city. And Odysseus's personal issues affect that a lot. Their personal issues also affect them. They depend on each other, and they need to all exercise the virtues. And when they don't, there's instability, there's chaos, people suffer. Okay. One of the main themes in Aristotle's politics is the greed is the political evil. Obviously, in the Iliad, it's a terrible evil. Even in the Odyssey, when the troops were given a bag of winds, and Odysseus was using these winds to get home, and they got really close to home, and then the troops thought the bag had gold and silver in it, so they opened the bag up. And because of their greed, they were blown away, and they had how many more, I don't know, years or whatever of having to get back home. So that was their fault, but most of the problem was Odysseus' fault, which I'll talk about later. Okay. Now, I wanted to just summarize the different ways that the gods and goddesses I talked about in mythology are playing themselves out in the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So you have Demeter is the goddess of fertility of the earth, and Poseidon is the god of the wind and Okay, so it's obvious that, and the sea. So it's obvious that the Greeks depend upon the sea to get, obviously, to get to Troy and to get home from Troy. They depend very heavily on the winds, and we know that Artemis um, was mad at a soldier. The story of Iphigenia is shows, I don't want to tell the story at the moment, but what it shows is that Artemis has control over the winds in that case. She caused the winds not to blow, and so the soldiers were sitting on shore starving. So, everybody who listens to the Iliad knows that story. So, time and time again, the people are worried about getting enough food. They also trample over the earth and sometimes just wreak havoc. They have to kill animals. Artemis's turf, the wilderness, they depend on that. They depend upon Poseidon, the god of the sea. So they should really get over pride and thinking they have control when they don't. They're very vulnerable to these natural forces and they don't admit it. They're obsessed by going and kicking some Trojan butt, and then the winds don't blow. And Agamemnon has to kill his oldest daughter to get him to blow, which I'll go talk about next time. But I mean, you're so vulnerable. And then on the way back, the winds blow too much, and a whole lot of troops are lost because the boats crash in these huge storms. Okay, so that's there. That's just should be part of your psyche. It should be part of your worldview. We're aiming for the microcosm in the macrocosm. Demeter is there, part of what you have to consider. Poseidon is there. You have to pay attention to him. Artemis is there. You have to be careful and not violate her wilderness. Um, let's see. Her brother, well, okay, the other one is Aphrodite, obviously. You have to um, watch out and not go to an extreme. But it's not anti sensual. The Greek stuff is very sensual. It gives you images of um, visual beauty, visual settings, and also they eat, drink, they make merry. They're not anti-sensuous. But there is a story that the bard tells in the Odyssey that really gives you the punchline, which the Greeks already knew from the myths, but they retell the story, which is how it should have been. So when Aphrodite is married to Hephaestus, and somebody's home is filled with beautiful craftsmanship, and everything is carefully crafted, and so you have this wonderful experience of sensuality while you're also engaged in fidelity, sexual fidelity. That's the way it ought to be. And then when Aphrodite gets attracted to Ares, the god of war, she cheats on her husband. They go off together, and it creates havoc. And that's exactly what happened that started the Trojan War, is that Aphrodite, Helen, ran away with, and war was started. So, so that story is actually retold in the Odyssey by the bard who's in the Phoenicia, which is the ideal, the best, the city that's better than most cities. They have a bard telling these stories to educate people. And they do have a wealthy city, but it's not at the expense of justice. Um, it's all within the context of marital fidelity and basically a just social order. So, Aphrodite is back in the background. Um, and I guess at this point I'll tell the story, which I think, well, no, I'll tell that later. Dionysus is the god of wine, and they have drinking, but don't get drunk. That's in excess, and that's crude, creates a lot of problems. Hera and Ares are the god and goddess of honor, and I've talked about that. Um, Zeus and Athena are the god and goddess of justice, and I've already referred quite a bit to that. But that's my claim, is that Homer and Hesiod are really trying to get people to get this psyche, to develop their worldview, their minds at a higher level, so that you see that oaths, covenants, the rule of law, that should be what preoccupies people the most. And clearly, Athena is constantly talking to Odysseus. This is obviously what Homer wants people to be thinking about. He wants to educate them in this level of deliberation. Deliberation for the sake of developing and maintaining political association, not for the sake of protecting your own, being tribal, anything like that. But he does have another big theme, is Apollo, the capacity to engage in calculation, reasoning, using your intelligence. And Apollonian reasoning is that you do a good job of setting up the means to achieve your goals. Well, the trouble is, if you have the wrong goal, you might be pretty successful, but you're successful at committing horrendous injustices. And what happens is, Apollo starts out on the side of the Achaeans, and Zeus is on that side, Hera's on that side, Athena's on that side. It makes sense, right? They have the just cause. Well, then you find out Hera isn't on that side because of a just cause. She's on that side because she's mad because Paris chose Aphrodite instead of choosing her, which is the wrong reason. But Apollo starts out on the side with a just cause, but then he switches sides. When Agamemnon and defies the priest of Apollo, the priest of Delphi, and doesn't give him back his daughter, obviously Delphi is the center for the god Apollo. Apollo switches sides, and Hector is inspired by Apollo, and he uses all sorts of Apollonian reasoning. He's organized, but it's for the wrong cause, and so it ends up the Trojans, actually the war lasts longer, more people are killed, partly because Apollonian reasoning is over on the side of the unjust cause. And that's a big theme throughout the myths, is Apollo is a powerful god because he's the god of technology and calculation and medicine and all this stuff, knowledge, scientific knowledge, but it can be used for the wrong reasons and the wrong way, because it can be used for unjust goals. So that happens, and then also the other thing about Apollo is that he's emotionally immature. And that story comes out again in the Odyssey, when in Phoenicia the bard is telling about Aphrodite and Ares running away. And what happens is Hephaestus says to them, he catches them in the act, and he's a craftsman. So he creates this net, and he throws this net over them and tightens the net. So they're literally having sex. They're in the heightened state of orgasm, and he ropes them together so they can't separate, which of course isn't necessarily a very pleasant thought. But Apollo says, oh, this is what everybody wants anyway. This is every guy's ultimate fantasy, is to be continually having sex with Aphrodite. You're the most beautiful woman in the world. So it's clear that Apollo doesn't get that it's that kind of fantasy and that kind of motivation that starts wars, or that creates a lot of internal faction also. So Apollo doesn't get sexual attraction. His reasoning powers can be attached to emotional immaturity and injustice. And of course, that creates a lot of problems. We have many, many Apollonian CEOs who pride themselves on running tight ships, well organized corporations or whatever, and yet they're making chemical warfare, or they're making all sorts of products that use irrational sex to sell stuff, and they create advertising that appeals to every irrational desire in the book, but they run a good corporation, right? And they make money and they create jobs and everything's peachy keen. And the Greeks would say, no, it's not. It's not. Apollonian reasoning can, you have to have it if you want to flourish, but if it's tied to the wrong goals, you're going to tank. You're going to be a very unhealthy society. So that's a clear message from very early on in the Iliad. And it's a clear message in a lot of the tragedies also. Then you have Hermes and Hestia, and periodically Zeus sends Hermes down to send the messages from the gods. And then you have Hades and Persephone, and that's where the story of Odysseus going down into Hades. I think my interpretation is that he sees three main people. He sees Agamemnon, Ajax, and Achilles. And Agamemnon has gone home after the war, and he killed his oldest daughter before he left, and his wife has gone and allowed his arch enemy cousin to come and become king, and then when he arrives, she stabs him to death. Okay, and on the other hand, Odysseus has the opposite. He has a very faithful wife who's fending off suitors and waiting and hoping that he'll come home. So they have exactly the opposite, which is good, a good lesson, because Odysseus was the just character in the Iliad, and in the end, justice pays. This is an old theme, because what really matters is over time, and Odysseus has, his father was a just man, he's a just man, and his son is looking like he's been raised in a way that there's every reason to think he will become a just man, and Ithaca will be in good hands. And the only thing that caused Ithaca to go downhill was that Odysseus had to leave to take care of other people's problems, which is one other incredibly important reason why you shouldn't commit injustice, because the best people have to pay the price, and they tend to be the most courageous soldiers, so they tend to die, whereas the lousy people are cowards, so they manage to stay alive. Anyway, so when Odysseus goes into Hades, he sees three people, and Agamemnon has been killed by his wife. So it's incredibly ironic, it's another reversal, that Odysseus went home. When he stepped onto the turf at Argos, he was the most powerful man in the world, as far as they knew. He had been the king, his side won the war, everybody was beholding to him. Within an hour or two, he had been stabbed to death by his wife, which is about the most humiliating thing that can happen to you. So here he is in Hades going, oh my God, I was killed by my wife, and this is his legacy for eternity. This is And it's also his legacy on Earth, right? So the punchline there is don't be ignorant. Okay? It was Agamemnon's pride that caused him not to even occur to him that his wife might not be real happy about this. And so when she flatters him to death when he comes off the chariot, he should be suspicious. Like, but no, he just eats it up as if he deserves all of that flattery, even though he killed their daughter. Um, so, and I'll talk about that when I do the Agamemnon, but that's the message. Like, you are responsible for your ignorance. You cannot use it as an excuse. So, get over your pride so that you can actually see, understand other people. People who don't think you are wonderful. People who have their own issues between you and them, between each other. Just get over yourself so you can see things for what they are. And that's also a message in the Odyssey, because Odysseus commits an act of pride, which I'll discuss in a minute, but at various times he becomes nobody. He ends up shipwrecked. He doesn't even have any clothes on or any ship or anything when he gets to Phoenicia. When he gets back to Ithaca, he's hidden as a beggar. And when he does that, when he's nobody, he gets to see people for who they are. He's not playing a role. They don't have to hide in front of him. They don't have to play a role. They just are who they are, because you have no status and they don't have any reason to cover up. And the way they treat you, all of a sudden, his eyes are opened. He understands things he didn't understand before. And so that's the message. Agamemnon didn't do that and paid a price. So you are responsible for your ignorance. And again, Homer's stories and the stories of Greek paideia are trying to educate people who generally have privilege and who can't, don't end up beggars, don't end up naked on the shore, to try and understand people that are not like them, motivated different sex, class, ethnicity, culture, so that they know how to treat them. They know who's trustworthy and who's not. Um, so I think that's the punchline about Agamemnon. You don't say, well, I had good intentions. Well, I didn't know. Forget it. Your legacy is determined by the choices you make. And if your weakness of character caused you to make a bad choice, it doesn't matter if you had good intentions. The whole thing about tragedy is everybody has good opinions, which means good intentions, good reason, or they have reasons. They're just wrong. And then the one about Ajax is get over your grudges, get over your extremes, your obsessions, because you will go down in history. That will be your legacy, that you had this obsession, and then you'll have to live with it for eternity also. So flesh that one out. And then Achilles was flesh out the desire for glory. If there comes a time when you have to go to war and you have to be brave to preserve hospitality or for some just cause, fine, but don't use it as an occasion to gain glory. Don't think of the ultimate point of life is glory in battle, to the point where you will massacre, you will not hold your rulers accountable for just and unjust wars, and all of those other ways that war goes wrong. The only way to avoid unnecessary war is to make sure people are not getting rewarded for it, either monetarily or through public honor. You should value a relatively obscure life, be grateful if it never happens that you live at a time where you need to go to war, and be don't be greedy. That's another big, your household. Aristotle talks about the theory of the household. Make sure you engage in natural acquisition. Your household has what you need, but not excesses. Um, and just enjoy life. I mean, life in and of itself, ruling for the sake of the ruled, being a good spouse, a good parent, kind of generic stuff is just fine. That's a fulfilled life and a happy life. It will promote stability, so you'll have leisure time for the arts, the sciences, community building, relationship building. Those are the things that make life worth living. Um, and then there was Tantalus and Sisyphus, and Tantalus was, um, anyway. So there's lots of messages. Those are the three main ones, I think, from the story of Hades. And that was, so I just finished the list of how all the gods and goddesses are implicitly played out in these stories. Sometimes it's brought up, sometimes it's not. And of course, there's many, many other ways that the Homer himself explains the interventions of the deities. Now, he does say at the beginning, don't take this literally, that it is shocking how heartless the gods and goddesses are. But this is exactly what happens when people are what Jung calls identified with the complex. When they get obsessed, it's frightening how heartless people are and how unable to put themselves in the other guy's shoes, and how easily they demonize the enemy and blame them for whatever the problem is. And they become self-righteous. I mean, it's just frightening to me. But when you look at the way the gods and goddesses act, the point is, people really can be that way. And so find a way to educate your mind so that whenever you're in a critical situation, you understand how complicated it is, and you step back, and your goal is negotiation. Try to find a way to negotiate and compromise. Because when you don't, this is what you get. All the stuff in the Iliad. And not just the way the humans treat each other, but the way the gods treat humans. And it is truly scary. But it's, the other thing is that technologically we're never going to get to the point where human nature changes. This is, the Greeks are trying to pass on insights about the ways we go wrong in relationship to these very, very basic drives that are not going to go away. Sex and aggression, and the way that cultures nurture them, either in a way that makes for more social chaos, for social devolution to a primitive state, and then what you have to do if you really want to harness Aphrodite and Ares' pleasure, pain, and fear, if you want to channel those basic drives in a way that creates a stable, flourishing society of people who have the time and the inclination to cultivate these higher powers of soul. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention was to reinforce my argument about this, is that Hesiod, in many different places in the works and days, actually refers indirectly to the Iliad in a way that reinforces my interpretation. First of all, he starts out the works and days with his concept of strife. And he says there's two kinds of strife: the really negative stuff that ends up with aggression and violence, and then a kind of creative strife. So in the Theogony, you have this evolution from Uranus to Kronos to Zeus. And I think he's showing that evolution is inevitable. Natural evolution, social evolution. Each generation is born into a more complex situation. And so the older generation needs to train the younger one in the basic drives, the basic wisdom, and then let go, have a peaceful transfer of power. Well, of course, that's what doesn't happen in the Iliad. Priam is an enabler. He lets Paris run his city when he shouldn't. And Agamemnon gets in a power struggle with Achilles, and he doesn't let Achilles have his woman when he should. So those are the two ways that can go wrong. And it creates strife. So it's all just like the Theogony has all this unnecessary strife. The Iliad also shows you all this. And Hesiod, it's a catharsis, is trying to point out to you that the human project is to pass things on from one generation to the next. The next thing, well, that was how the whole story of the Trojan War got started, was that the gods had a banquet. They did not invite Irsis, the goddess of strife. She got mad. She got a golden apple and rolled it onto the banquet table. Everybody fought for it, right? She created all this strife. Zeus was given the apple and told that he could decide who to give it to. Zeus made a mistake by giving it to the best-looking young man, Paris. Are we often deceived by glamour? Yes. Just like that issue with Telemachus going to Menelaus' house. Yeah, it's easy to get fooled by physical beauty. Don't do it. So again, at the beginning of how the Trojan War started, you got the story of Zeus fooled by good looks at the very, all the way into the Odyssey, same old thing. It's like, does anybody learn anything? So he gives it to Paris. Paris has three choices. He can give the golden apple to Athena, and she will give him wisdom. He can give it to Hera. She will give him power. Or he can give it to Aphrodite. She will give him the most beautiful woman in the world. This is a classic. This is an archetype. I tell my students this in college. You have to decide who you're going to give the golden apple to, who you're going to give your eros to, your passion, your creative energies. Are you going to dedicate yourself to some sense of calling, some way to make the world a better place, to make a difference, to engage in justice or community building in some way that's by nature honorable? Or are you going to dedicate yourself to power, success, worldly success, and power? If you do, you're going to get into power struggles because you're going to be with other people who seek the same thing. And that's negative strife. That's power for the sake of power. And the Iliad shows you that just leads to destruction. Or are you going to give it to Aphrodite? Of course, Paris, because he was good looking, gave it to Aphrodite, and lo and behold, the most beautiful woman in the world, for some strange reason, was already married. So he goes to Menelaus and he steals Helen and takes her back, and Paris lets him take her in, and the Trojans have an assembly and vote to take her in, even though the priests say no. So the Trojans were defying the gods, and they paid the price. So that's the story everybody already knows. Hesiod, in his story, in Works and Days, he plays the role of Prometheus. So I think that's very interesting, because in his Theogony, the generation after Zeus, one of the stories is Prometheus. And Prometheus defies Zeus and steals fire and gives human beings um, really an opportunity to develop. So Prometheus is the one who gives fire, who gives tools to people so that they can develop their capabilities. And Zeus is portrayed as um, taking revenge. And again, that should be, since Hesiod is actually playing the role of Prometheus in the Works and Days, it should be obvious that the story of the Theogony is about what not to do. It's not about the gods, it's about you'll be tempted, um, if you're the boss, not to want the next generation to be smarter than you or more advanced. If you start competing with them, if they humiliate you, like they can do something that it took you a long time to do, well, get over it. Um, because otherwise you just create problems. So Hesiod plays the role of um, Prometheus, and he's advising his little brother about um, life, how to live life. And um, he, anyway, I think my hour's up, so I'm going to have to go to the next one. The next one will be Homer number 3.